Hello, and welcome to Out in Space, the podcast for LGBT astronomers and allies. I am Vlad. I'm an assistant professor of astronomy at an MSU, and I am bisexual.
I'm Cass. I'm a Winton Fellow in Theoretical Astrophysics and Exoplanets at the University of Leicester, and I'm gay.
I'm Alex Ticci. I'm a graduate student at Columbia University, and I'm gay.
I'm Jody Burtis. I am a graduate student at New Mexico State University, and I'm gay.
Yeah, okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Out in Space. Today, joining us is Danielle Leonard. So Danielle obtained her PhD from Oxford University in 2016, where she was one of the incredibly prestigious Rhodes Scholars, and her thesis was entitled Beyond the Standard Cosmological Paradigm with Weak Gravitational Lensing. After graduation, she worked at Carnegie Mellon University as a McWilliams postdoctoral fellow until 2019, at which point she became a lecturer in astronomy at Newcastle University in the UK. Now, for our American listeners, this is roughly equivalent to tenure-track assistant professor in the States. She continues to research the standard cosmological model, teach students, and engage in departmental service. Danielle, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Cass. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So I was wondering if you could tell us, first of all, a little bit more about your science. What are you working on at the moment?
Sure. So as may have been evident from the thesis title and the introduction, I am an observational cosmologist, and specifically I focus on late time observational cosmology, so cosmology with big galaxy surveys. And the kinds of measurements I think about with respect to that are galaxy clustering, so using the positions, the statistical properties of the positions of large samples of galaxies, as well as weak gravitational lensing, so looking more at shapes, usually of very large samples of galaxies, and trying to make statistical measurements of the correlations between those things, and use those to infer parameters or understand, do model comparisons in terms of cosmological models. And so particularly, I'm interested in extensions to the standard cosmological model. So one thing I think quite a bit about is potential modifications to gravity on very large scales, as well as potentially dynamical dark energy, alternative neutrino scenarios, things like that. And in terms of the data that I work with or that I am preparing for, so I've worked with the Dark Energy Survey, which is a photometric survey that's finished taking data, but the data we're still analyzing at this point. So we've done a full cosmological analysis for the first year of data, and we're now working on the first 3 years. And specifically within that, I've worked on testing gravity with galaxy clustering and weak lensing data. And then I'm also heavily involved with the cosmology science collaboration within for LSST, which is now of late known as the Legacy Survey of Space and Time at the Whitman Observatory, right? So the telescope formerly known as the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. And obviously that has a lot of different astronomy that you could do with it that's very exciting for the whole community. But yeah, I've been heavily involved with the cosmology collaboration, doing pipeline development and validation for that.
Oh, nice. Really, really nice. So loads of stuff, really interesting. Very good, very good. Okay, so perhaps now you could tell us a little bit more about sort of, your personal life. So where do you identify on the LGBT spectrum?
Before we go on that question, can I ask about what you work on, especially for the people listening to us that are not working in astronomy? You mentioned that you work on modifications of gravity at large scales. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, why do we think gravity could change?
Sure.
We know, right, how it works when you apply that to the planets around the sun. That's Newton, right? So gravity has been tested well, right, at these distances. But then, I mean, how far can we trust that we know how gravity works?
Sure. So as you allude to, we understand how gravity works very well on, sort of Earth scales, and Newtonian gravity, as you mentioned, is very good at describing the sort of lab scales on Earth. So, I drop a ball, I know how it's going to fall. even within the solar system, we understand it really well. But even there, to get everything precisely right, we do have to go into general relativity, which is, of course, Einstein's theory of gravity, which reduces to Newton's gravity on Earth scales, but provides, additional description on solar system scales. That's all really well tested and really understood. We haven't yet had the opportunity until quite recently, and even still, it's just starting to be able to test the way the gravity works on much larger scales. So particularly, I'm looking at scales like between galaxies. So scales of, ones to tens of megaparsecs, which I know that's an absolutely useless unit for non-astronomers, but you can think about it as scales, between galaxies. And the reason that I think that is interesting is twofold, I guess. So one is, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, and probably many of our listeners are familiar with, the idea of dark energy. So, 20 years ago, we have the discovery that the expansion of the universe is accelerating. This is sort of surprising. We don't understand why. Maybe it's a cosmological constant that fits the data super well, but it's very unsatisfactory theoretically. There are sort of reasons to consider other things. And one thing that could have potentially explained this is a modified theory of gravity. So the reason I frame that in terms of dark energy is of course that dark energy is another way that we could explain this. And when we talk about a cosmological constant, what we're talking about in some sense is a constant background vacuum dark energy. So modified gravity theories, so deviations from our standard theory of gravity on these very large scales can, you can try to use that to explain accelerated expansion. People, if you put the right people in a room with that, they'll argue till, they run out of breath. But I think that even aside from that, even leaving aside that motivation, there's the intrinsic motivation that we haven't tested the way that gravity works empirically on these scales yet. And we are able to with the kinds of data sets that we are getting now from surveys like the Dark Energy Survey and others, as well as LSST and also the space-based contemporary survey, which is going to be Euclid. We have the opportunity to pin this down in a way that we haven't before. And so we might as well, because we're learning something about the physical laws of the universe on very large scales that we didn't know experimentally before.
Cool.
Okay. Really, really nice.
I'm an
Does
extra
anybody have
pointed
any
person, so
I
yeah,
know as well. I was just kind of like,
hard.
I operate on the other end of the scale.
No, exoplanets are great.
Does anybody else have any more science questions? No, we're good. Okay. So I guess I'll ask then. So could you tell us a little more about your personal life and sort of where you identify on the LGBT spectrum?
Sure. So I'm bisexual. I'm a bisexual cisgender woman. I'm not sure if there's more you want from that.
No. I think it's just better to get people to express how they identify themselves rather than us assuming. Yeah. Sure. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your coming out experience, particularly in the workplace, and whether or not you feared it may affect you professionally.
Sure. So maybe I'll work backwards. So in my current position at Newcastle, which I started, as you said, less than a year ago, I have been out in that position from before I started, from the interview. And the reason that was the case was because as part of the interview process for the position, there was a requirement to give not only the science talk, but there was a short talk expected in terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion issues and what work the candidates had done, like including myself, had done, and what plans we might have. And so obviously that was a good sign for me in terms of that being included in the recruitment process. It made me think, okay, well, probably it's safe to come out. And also I was thinking, this was a long-term position, like as you said, equivalent to a tenure track position. And it put me more in the position of thinking, well, they better know now, because I don't want to be here for the rest of my life if I'm going to have a problem about this. So I basically decided to just come out in that. And of course, I didn't get up and say explicitly like, hi, I'm bisexual, but I did talk about the work that I had done previously with, you know, LGBT groups and stuff like that. And so I effectively outed myself, and I said, well, they're either going to hire me or they're not. And in fact, they hired 2 people in that recruitment round, and they hired me and they hired another queer woman who's also trans. So like top points for Newcastle in terms of hiring.
Very good.
So it turned out okay in that regard. So everybody kind of knows already. I've got my rainbow lanyard around my neck all the time at work. In my previous positions, I would say as a postdoc, I was fairly out, like I wasn't hiding it or anything, but it was not something I would necessarily bring up. You know, I recall sitting in a meeting where somebody sort of said off the cuff, like, isn't it funny that we don't have any LGBT members of staff in the department? And I was sort of sitting there like, yes, hilarious. That's so funny. And of course it's like, I'm there being like myself. And then it's like, I know that I could, I know a few more, they're just not out to you. Right. So that was that. I mean, I was certainly out as a pretty vocal ally in that position. I had like a safe zone sticker on my door, and I'd done the training for that. And so people either, they knew if it came up or they didn't. And prior to that, as a graduate student, it was a bit different. So I do recall in the first couple of years of my PhD, somewhat consciously deciding not to be out even to my cohort, and that was a bit, that was a privilege, and we might talk about this later in terms of bisexual erasure, because I was in a monogamous relationship with a man at that point. And so it was very easy to let people assume that I was straight, and I didn't really know like how people would react. And I never sort of directly came out to my PhD supervisor, even though I didn't have any reason to believe that he would have reacted in any bad way. And if it came up now, it would be fine, I think. But I think when I was a graduate student, I was more concerned about, and rightly so, I think, there was more of, my professional skin riding on what the more senior people in the department may or may not think about me and that aspect of my identity. Whereas, as I've become more established, I've felt more confident to be out and, sort of come what may.
I think that's quite a common theme. When you're a grad student, you're incredibly vulnerable to the whims of whoever is in charge of your personal and professional well-being, and you can get lucky and you can have supportive supervisors. You can be incredibly unlucky, or you can just have supervisors that are ambivalent to these issues, which can in some ways be almost just as bad. And I think these things can be really damaging. So I see why people would choose not to come out if they have the option.
I'm sort of interested in this sort of history, as I think you're an American, is that right?
I'm actually Canadian.
Canadian. Sorry, I was like, no, maybe she's Canadian. But you've lived on both sides of the pond at this point, and
several times.
Working in Oxford. I've been to Oxford, small little place. I'm always kind of interested in what we have to go through as astronomers in this niche field. You take a job where you can find it, and sometimes in very small places. And so I'm just kind of curious about your experience of relocating to different people. I guess maybe it's easier if you have a partner when you do the relocating versus showing up to a new place and being single and trying to, find the scene there. So kind of what's your experience about what it's been like here and
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I guess I would say, in terms of finding a community, my experience was that as a graduate student, it was fairly straightforward. In Oxford, like being a student is kind of a great time for that, because there are, student societies and everything. And I definitely, was able to find community in that way, and I ended up running a particular LGBT society there, and that was great. And when I moved to Pittsburgh, I actually found it a little bit more difficult. Like I did find, you know, a community in a sort of at a smaller scale. You know, I had a friend who in Pittsburgh who I met not through LGBT stuff, through something else, but who was a gay man, and I asked him at some point, you know, have you found it? Have you found the gay scene in Pittsburgh? And he's like, I found a choir. There's a queer choir, and I go to it. And I was like, oh, cool. I didn't know that you like to sing. He was like, I don't like to sing, Danielle. I just had to go to something.
I just want to go where the other gays are.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. And then Newcastle has been pretty great so far, I have to say. And of course, like it's been great. Like I said, like they hired two of us at the same time who are both queer women. So we've, you know, had each other to kind of be like, oh, did you see this like event? Are you going to this? So that's nice. One thing that I would say that like isn't my specific experience, but I think like doesn't necessarily get talked about, but is an LGBT issue in terms of the relocation that's inherent to our career paths that I just wanted to mention because I think it's worth saying is being trans and trying to seek trans healthcare in different countries under different systems is complete nonsense. Like it is so bad. Just from talking to friends who are doing this academic nomad thing and trying to have continuous care. You know, what one country requires this kind of documentation, one country requires that kind of documentation. Every country expects that you have the documentation from their own country, and they're like, cool, well, I have this thing from this other country, but you don't recognize that. So I just, you know, that's not my experience, but I think it's worth mentioning as a big roadblock for our community in terms of the intersection of like being trans and requiring that kind of support and also having to move around so much.
Wow.
Yeah, that must be really difficult. I think that's, you know, when you're cisgender, that's not even something you necessarily, you know, you barely think about it, right? And then I think as well you've got to deal with you know, changing attitudes between places and all of these sorts of things as well, which is, you know, bad enough I think for people who are, you know, LB or G, but for T it must be especially difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I already moved, you know, from several countries. I mean, between many countries, from the PhD to postdoc to faculty. It's already hard enough to sort out the labor laws and benefits in different countries. Let's say, you know, transgender laws. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Jodie, would you like to ask a few questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So Danielle, can you tell us a little bit about your role models? So did you have a senior queer scientist to look up to as a student? And if you did, how did it help? And if you didn't, how would it have helped?
Sure. So yeah, I thought this was an interesting question because I read it when you guys sent me the, you know, the sort of potential questions we might talk about. And I realized I had never thought about it before, which is bizarre. But then I thought back and I realized I did actually have a couple of people, and I just maybe hadn't, for some reason, conceptualized them in that way as queer role models, but they actually were. So I had a prof when I was in undergrad, so this was in Canada, who was one of the only women faculty in my department, 3 women out of about 40 or something, and who was also, I was about to say she was gay. I actually don't know if she could have been bi. She had a female partner. And yeah, so and I knew that because people are terrible and sort of would refer to, you know, other students would be like, oh, who have you got for this class this semester? Oh, you've got like Chris Paduska. She's the lesbian. It's like, okay, well, thanks. Okay,
the lesbian.
The lesbian. There's 3 women. Nice. That's the lesbian. And yeah, so, but as I had her for first year physics, and I also had her for a 4th year seminar class. And we never talked about like LGBT issues. I got a little bit, you know, to a point where I could ask her sort of mentory type questions when I was in 4th year, and we had this like 6-person class with her. And I remember at the time just kind of being really happy that there was like a woman around who I could chat to about things. But in retrospect, you know, it was also comforting to know that there's at least like one other LGBT woman in the department. Someone who was a bit more of someone who I actually directly spoke to about LGBT issues was when I was an undergrad. I did some summer research terms at a different university, also in Canada, and in the research group there was a senior PhD student who was an out gay man, and we became friends, as you know, as did many of us in the research group. And he and I did chat quite a bit about LGBT issues, and he was coming up to the end of his PhD and applying for postdocs, and you know, trying to deal with his partner, and his partner was American, and things like you know, and this was before, you know, gay marriage was legal in the States and everything. And yeah, so we actually had a lot more overt chats about LGBT. His name is Sean Stotai. He's now faculty at University of Calgary. He's a great guy. Yeah, so I mean, it was helpful in the sense, I guess, that I think if I hadn't had that, it would have been quite isolating. Like, I obviously it didn't like stick out in my mind as being something that at the time I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful that I have this, because otherwise I would have remembered and thought about it earlier. But I think it's one of those things where I was lucky enough to have it, and therefore you know, it didn't stick out. But if I hadn't had it, it probably would have stuck out a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That brings up a question to me. I don't know if you've experienced this yourself, but you know, going along with this relocation with a partner, you know, these laws of you know, immigration laws, they might not always support LGBT plus individuals as well. Have you had any experience with that, or happen to know people that have said, you know, if I had a wife, it would be no problem, but because I have a husband.
Yeah. So I mean, I haven't had direct experience with that. I have relocated with a partner, but I've never had the experience of having the immigration law be a problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, in that particular way, immigration law is a pain regardless, right? I guess a bunch of us on this call know that.
Yes.
But no, I haven't had that particular issue. I mean, I'm certainly acutely aware of it. I mean, there's someone I can speak, like, not from my own experience, but someone, like a very close person in my life, who had she has a female partner, and was working in so she's an engineer, and she does work with Engineers Without Borders, and so she's you know, working in Ghana and thinking, okay, well, this is fine for like this 3-month stint, but you know, this isn't going to work long term, because I can't exactly bring my girlfriend on a spousal visa if we get married. So yeah, it's definitely a very serious thing.
I think as well, things have really changed over the last few years, you know, so like I'm in the process of trying to move to the US at the moment. And I was a bit sort of like, oh, I don't know how this is going to be, because I'm, you know, going to like a southern state and this sort of thing. And, you know, the entire university has been so helpful. They've just been like, you know, we'll help your wife find a job. And I just think, oh, you know, even just how different the world was even, you know, 10 years ago. Especially in the UK, like I remember things being very bad growing up, and now I just can't imagine it being as bad. I don't know. I hope things will get better all over the world, but I am not optimistic that it will be in the short term.
Yeah, and it's really great that you had that you know, the female lesbian role model, because I think for the younger generation that's just getting started in the field, I think it's you know, the first thing that I think of when I'm trying to get a role model that I can relate to is a female, you know, a female scientist.
Yeah.
And it's great when you can find one and you have things in common, and you know, you have different, or you have similar struggles, and you know, they can provide such great advice about maneuvering the field as a minority. But I think one of the things that I frequently forget about is how important it is to have a queer role model as well. And so I don't have many, but the few that I do have, I think upon realizing that they are this great queer female role model, I'm struck with awe that I have this now, that I can picture myself in this field as this person. And it's very inspiring, and it helps me, you know, realize that I can do this. They did it, I can do this. And so I think that's important.
You're really right, Jodie. I think it's you know, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's very difficult to be something you can't see.
I would say as well, I've been in the situation of being, like, obviously I'm still quite junior, but I've been in the situation of having you know, a bit of a mentoring relationship with a student who in fact was male, but because I was out, you know, they started coming to me about like, oh, what do you think about this? Like, should I, you know, what should I do about this situation? And yeah, so I think that there are definitely situations where people seek out queer role models specifically, because in that case, it's like, well, it certainly wasn't the gender, but there were specific things that this particular student wanted to talk about with someone who got it from an LGBT perspective.
Alrighty, so the next question that we have for you is, so lesbian and bisexual women in astronomy face being a minority on 2 counts. So what do you think are the main problems that bisexual women astronomers face, and how would this experience differ from those of straight women and lesbian women in astronomy?
Yeah, so I thought a bit about this. I think that for me, the thing that always sticks out as a difference in like the bisexual experience in terms of the work environment is that it's, in a way, in order to be out, you have to sort of make this very strong statement about things that people kind of don't want to talk about at work. So even if you have a partner, or you know, you're casually talking about like, oh, I was on, what were you doing the other weekend? Oh, I went on this date or something. Even if you know, if you can say, you know, okay, this is my girlfriend, that doesn't clarify your sexuality, right? This is my boyfriend. That it's not clear, and so you know, you end up having to be very blunt about it. You know, you almost have. I joke that I have these conversations where, you know, where it's like, this is my partner, but I would like to be clear that I am interested in romantic and sexual relationships with people of any and all genders. You know, and then you're like at a work meeting and people are like, that's great, Danielle. But no, it's not quite like that, right? But it is this bizarre thing of it's kind of the sexuality where you have to be super specific about it, or
I think also as well, to say you're bisexual, like the word sexual is in the word, and you know, certainly if you're British, you're just like, you know, rather than say anything out loud, you know.
Yeah. And so I think especially for physics and astronomy, there's like an extra layer of that where you know, we have this culture in the field of things are meant to be very, you know, based on facts and, you know, sort of a pure pursuit of knowledge, and we don't have a personal life. And, you know, these are all sort of wishy-washy things that we aren't supposed to talk about, and definitely not have any feelings, and certainly not any sexual or romantic feelings. So it's like an extra hostile environment in some cases to that kind of a statement. And then in terms, so that's you know, that's answering the question of what is a bit weird about being bisexual that isn't a thing that necessarily comes up for you know, say gay or lesbian astronomers, but specifically for women, I think there's kind of a compounding factor sometimes, or there can be, where you know, you're already a woman, right? So you're already like sort of, if you say anything that's a little bit more on the like, you know, deviating from this like hard facts and you know, the sort of the truth of the matter and the math and the science, and that's seen worse generally for a lot of people from a woman. And so when you're a woman and you're like, yes, but I would really like to make clear to you who I like to have sexual and romantic relationships with. I think there's a compounding factor potentially. Although I would say that it might, it could be mitigated by the fact that, and I don't know if any of you would want to speak to this, but there's certainly unique challenges to coming out as bisexual as a man as well, in terms of like the culture potentially being less accepting in different ways.
Yes, so I'm not bisexual, so I can't speak about that, but maybe somebody else can.
No, yeah, I think that you touched the point that indeed happens for both women and men, right? When you are at the B type of the spectrum, right? It seems that there is still the idea that oh, you don't know yet if you're gay or straight, right? And it's the whole compartmentalization thing, right? So it's the erasure issue, which kind of makes it uncomfortable at times, right? And people deal with it in different ways, right? It's you can say, right? I mean, if you are with a person from one gender, but you want to say that you also date people from the other genders or had it in your past, that's something that I have seen coming up several times. Like you have to assert that in a way. Of course,
Yeah.
like it's up to each person. And I don't know, I'm kind of rambling at the moment, but it's I mean, as you mentioned, right, in your, I mean, when you did your interview, that came up, that's something that came up on mine too. And the issue, yeah, that comes in your mind is, yeah, these are the people that I'm going to be working with for the foreseeable future. So I would rather that, right, to be clear from day one. I mean, like the worst thing that can happen is you take the job and then you find out later on that you are working with homophobes, biphobes, and you don't want that, right, to happen. Yeah. No, yeah. The issue, right, about bi erasure. We are. I mean, well, in the LGBT community, right, the B are usually erased from it because there is the tendency, right, to compartmentalize it either as gay or straight, and especially for bi people, if you are dating a person from one gender, that comes out quite strongly, right? I mean, like when you are with someone from the opposite gender, right, it's easy to typecast you as a straight person. You mentioned, right, that like when you're dating a man during your PhD, that came out as a, well, I mean, that it was not something that you felt that you needed to talk about, because people assumed whatever they wanted to assume. That comes up also, right, in I mean, with me, with other people. I mean, like I am with someone of the opposite gender, with a woman, and I try to say partner, like not girlfriend or wife, and then when it comes up in conversation about past relationships with men, then I try to put in the small talk that it was a he, right? make the genders quite clear. That's how I deal, like with bi erasure. I was wondering about you then, how you deal with that. Like, has bi erasure impacted you? Like, is it mixed in a way? I mean, like, sometimes it can be beneficial, sometimes harmful. If you could comment on it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and I think that the main way that it has impacted me professionally is, to be honest, probably positive, right? I mean, I tend to use the word erasure to discuss like the negative aspects, but then the flip side of the coin is passing privilege. And I certainly have benefited from straight passing privilege at certain times during my career, and probably at many times. Professionally, I mean, certainly people assume that I'm straight sometimes. Like, certainly that happens, and that is, that is erasure. But I think, if you're talking about professionally, I think it's almost, I can't, sorry, I can't, I don't think, I think that's been the main impact, and, positive or something, right? I think, the way that it's had more of a negative impact is probably personally, which, yeah, it's the same, it's not a novel story, right? It's not I'm sure that, Vlad and other people have had similar experiences. Like, bisexuality is not an identity that is represented terribly well in, media. It's even in terms of, like, actual, people like celebrities or, people who are well known, even if they are bisexual, often that's not known. Like, it's the same thing over and over again, right? Like, people have to actually come out and say, like, no, I'm actually bisexual. And that just doesn't always happen. And so for me, what that meant was that it took a long time for me to be comfortable with my own sexuality, with my own identity, because I think for myself, it's two sides of the coin, right? It's like privilege versus erasure. Like, if when I was a teenager, like a young teenager, looking back, it's supremely obvious to me that I was super queer, right? But it was very easy for my brain to go, okay, I have these feelings about boys, and those are like the normal feelings, and we pursue those feelings. And these feelings about girls are also normal, but they're really just friendship, and we're just going to keep them in that box, right? So, so it took a while for.
I love that.
Yeah, it took a while, and I think this is again a thing that might be a different experience between being a woman and being a man and being bisexual in some cases, because there's a way in which we allow women and girls to have intimacy and deep, like, caring feelings for each other that we don't really permit to boys and men in the same way culturally. And so I imagine, although I don't know that, if you're talking to friends, like male friends who have had a similar experience, right? Like, it's a much more jarring experience in some way to be a young teenager or a child and be having a crush on a boy if you're a boy, because all of culture is telling you no, versus as a girl, and you're like, I just want to be around this friend and hold her hand all the time and hug her and listen to her talk. That's normal or something, right? Yeah. I'm on a bit of a tangent now, but I guess what I'm saying is
it's a good tangent. It's a good tangent.
I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, that the aspect of erasure, I think, basically kept me from feeling confident in my identity for a long time. And even after I did self-identify as bi, which was around the age of 19, I even still, like, went through periods of oh, but maybe I'm really actually straight, or maybe I'm really actually gay. Like, I don't know. And it took a while. And then I think the other thing important to mention, which I think Vlad kind of brought up a little bit, although maybe not, is the other aspect of erasure. We tend to think of erasure as coming mostly from the outside, like from the straight community, but there's also like the gatekeeping aspect, which is from the LGBT community, which that to me has been perhaps the more like actively upsetting aspect, because it's, you know, you go to a space where you're hoping to be to find, you know, peers and people you're comfortable with, and that doesn't always happen. So that's more of a personal impact than a professional impact as well.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting when you talk about you know, like this idea of like passing for straight. It's like in my life I've experienced both you know, very strongly not passing as heterosexual, and for a long time being very easily able to pass as heterosexual, and then kind of as I've embraced more of my butchness as I've got older again, now I don't pass again, and it's very interesting to me to watch, you know, the percentage of the world that could identify me. Like my wife now calls me 100-footer, like you can spot that I'm gay from 100 feet, which makes me laugh, but that wasn't always the case, and just how generally, you know, my experience from everything from using public transport to shopping to everything like that changes depending on, you know, sometimes I go out in a dress, sometimes I go out in a shirt and tie, and what happens to me depends an awful lot on how I present in my I guess gender performance. I don't know, I don't really know what the right word is for that. So that's it was really interesting to hear you know, the flip side of the coin about, you know, erasure and passing, and, you know, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's also not necessarily good and bad, but like may work to your advantage or against you.
And I mean, there's also the aspect of that where if you are, you know, there's, again, it's two sides of a coin, right? It's like, you know, you can sometimes pass, or I can sometimes pass, but there's definitely an aspect where when I am feeling that erasure, like my I know my light is bizarre right now, sorry. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly times when I just say, like, you know, screw it, I don't care, I'm going to work in a plaid shirt, and of course I look gayer when I go to work in a plaid shirt. You know, I did my PhD at Oxford, has this weird costume you have to wear for your PhD, Viva, and there's a boy costume and a girl costume, and I wore the bow tie because I was like, screw it, it's my Viva.
Very good. Okay, so sorry.
Please go on.
No, Vlad, it's okay. I was just going to ask another question. So if you have something you'd like to say, please do.
I was just going to add to that, like the whole passing thing, right? It seems that there is an ideal that is the good, and we want to achieve that. And, you know, like everything that deviates from it is by default bad. Like the pass is an expression that I have seen used in other situations too, you know. I mean, like, you are Hispanic, but you're white passing.
Yeah.
You are trans, but you pass as cis, right? And for the bisexual community, that happens too, right? I mean, as you mentioned, right? Oh yeah, no, you're bi, but you pass as a straight person, or you pass as a gay person, right? There is a heteronormativity in the gay community. There is some sort of homonormativity also. I mean, like in a smaller proportion, and it seems that sometimes we don't fit in either box, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I should say, like, yeah, I definitely say passing privilege with a bit of tongue in cheek, because it's a you know, it's a bit of a poison privilege. but it can be a privilege.
As I say, right? I mean, when I myself was coming out to people saying, "Oh yeah, bi is twice the fun," I'd say that's twice the mess.
I like that. Yeah, very good. Okay, perhaps I can ask a few more questions if you're happy. Sure. Okay. So we alluded to this briefly earlier, but a study has suggested that students believe minorities bring political baggage into the classroom, i.e. the only cool head of objectivity can be a straight, white, cisgender male. What do you think about this?
Yeah, so I kind of think that simply by standing at the front of a classroom and asserting that I am going to teach you, first year introductory astrophysics, and it is in fact me, this, young looking woman who probably isn't who you were expecting, who's wearing a rainbow lanyard, who is in fact an expert in this and is going to teach it to you, that is in some sense a political statement, and because it goes against the norm of what we expect from a physicist. We don't expect a physicist to look like that.
So visibility is an act of defiance almost.
Yeah, and it's also like not a choice, right? Like I don't have an option to put on my cis white able-bodied straight man costume and go teach my class. And so yeah, I mean it is. I think in a sense the statement is it's true that there is a political element to me as a lecturer of physics or astronomy, but I think that the second part of the statement is more questionable, that there is some inherent good in this like quote level-headed end quote ideal of a someone for whom that's not the case, because I mean I'm preaching to the choir in terms of you folks, I think, but the only reason that a person is able to not have that political inherent political statement by in the classroom is if they naturally fit into the normative structure that we expect from a physics lecturer.
Occupy every position of power and privilege, right?
Right, and then that person, can then choose to bring politics into the classroom if they want to. Like, there's certainly space for, straight, white, cis, able-bodied men to, teach an introductory astronomy class and highlight, the women who have made great contributions and people of color who've made great contributions to astronomy. Like that's great if someone chooses to do that who does fit those criterion. I just think like for me it's kind of a moot question of whether like why would I not do that when I'm already like bothering people to some extent by standing here. And yeah, so to me the bigger it's already there. Like the politics is already there. So in a way, yes, I think there is like political baggage, but I didn't bring it. Like,
I think it's really interesting that the points that you're making. So one of the things that I found very interesting, and this is mostly more of an anecdotal thing, but I read online. So in the US they have like a website like Professor Reviews, and I think technically you could also review your UK professors, but it was so interesting just to read the differences between language that the students use to describe male and female professors. That the men were like confident and that they really knew their stuff, and the women were all kind of bossy and strict, or kind, or like kind and funny. And I'm just kind of like, I don't care if my professor's kind and funny, I want them to be smart and helpful. Like I don't know, like
yeah, I've definitely heard that as well, and I've definitely that was when I was in the States last year. A junior tenure track faculty member who is a friend of mine I was kind of like, what's the one thing I should know going into this? And she was like, don't rate my professors. Which is that way.
Yeah, I made the mistake of doing it once, and I'm just like, right, when I start teaching, that website's getting blocked. Like,
yeah, I definitely I've definitely had some gendered comments from students.
Has anybody else got any more thoughts on this? Okay.
We have a lot of thoughts on the student evaluation of faculty, but they're not here for this discussion.
Okay, so a study has suggested that gay women, and this study was specifically on gay women, think that their gender is more of a barrier to their career than their orientation. How do you feel about this, and do you think this is also true for bisexual women?
Yeah, so the short answer is that my experience is that that is also my experience, that my gender, I think, has been more of a barrier than my sexuality. I would say that with a pretty giant caveat, which is that I have only worked in places that the places I've worked or been part of, academia have been Canada, the UK, and the US. And there are certainly places where it is a way bigger issue to be gay or bisexual or trans than those places, right? Like I definitely like, just as an example, we were meant to have a collaboration meeting we did have a collaboration meeting in Brazil a year and a half ago, and Brazil, it's not it's not the worst place in the world to be.
I am Brazil.
Here. Yeah, exactly. But so we this was like, I think it was around the election of Bolsonaro, and there was we had a number of Brazilian astronomers within the collaboration who were, and basically there was basically we had to have a conversation around like what are the one of the Brazilian astronomers who was in the collaboration said, look, who was also trans, said, look, I've just been back. I didn't necessarily feel safe in the street. There's a lot of like hate going on right now, like how do we make sure that people are getting, you have to get public transit from like the airport to the university town where this is happening, like, and I'm not trying to pick on Brazil, like it's not like Brazil is the worst place or anything. But yeah, there are places I wouldn't go, like for a conference, like I wouldn't go to Russia because I think, I could be arrested for, promoting the gay or something. And that's fine. Yeah. And that's fine with me, to not have to go. That's not a big sacrifice. So I guess what I'm just trying to say as like a caveat is, what I'm saying is from like a position of, having worked in the UK, the US, and Canada. All that being said, yeah, I think my experience is that gender has been more of an issue. Something that really struck me was there was a study, and I don't know if any of you guys saw this, or I think it was 2018. There was a study that was looking at retention within STEM subjects of undergraduate students in 4-year university programs in the States. And it was looking at, if you looked at them at the beginning of the degree program and at the end, were they still in their STEM degree, or had they switched to a different type of degree, or did they drop out? And the retention of queer men was statistically significantly less than their straight counterparts, and the retention of queer women was higher than their straight counterparts. Oh. Yeah, and to be honest, like that is not surprising to me. I don't know about you guys, but I do meet a lot of queer women in astronomy.
I do too. Although I didn't have any like role models when I was kind of studying. Like as I started going to conference, I was just like, there is a lot of people here.
It occurs to me that is associated, at least in part, in child rearing, right? Straight women having children is, such a significant barrier to staying in astronomy.
Right. So this study was to do with undergraduates, so I'm not sure how big of an effect that would have had at that stage. But yeah,
I would assume small, because there's very few people nowadays, I think, who have very few women.
Yeah, at that age. Sorry, I missed it. It was
Yeah.
undergrad.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't know, my unfounded thought on a possible factor from that is that I think that we as a culture in science tend to associate you know, femininity with not being good at science, and for better or for worse, there's also an association that, you know, whether that's, you know, true or not, that, you know, queer men are in some sense more feminine and queer women are in some sense less feminine. And so in some sense, perhaps there is more of an acceptance of, you know, queer women because at least they're not as girly in some way. And that's obviously not true on an individual level for every queer woman. Like, you know, of course there are high femme lesbians, right? Like, but
yeah, it also makes me think about, you know, I wonder to the extent that it's the case that growing up queer, you have sort of eschewed these more traditional kind of like, oh, you know, I'm going to go play princess all the time. You know, something about growing up queer, just like growing up as a gay boy, you know, I gravitate more to the theater than most of my straight counterparts. You know, we've always been kind of thinking outside the box a little bit. And so to the extent that those pathways are kind of traditionally closed to straight girls, but then queer girls feel, you know, a little more maybe open to exploring these scientific pathways. I don't know. Just
maybe. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. That's actually a question that I asked Jane Rigby when we talked to her. That there seems to be indeed that over representation, as you mentioned, and maybe one of the reasons was that the science still is a white man game, right? And I mean, a lot less now than what it was before, but it still makes it easier for these you know, the status quo to respect a butch woman that they see as a person that can play the game by their rules than a flamboyant queer guy.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because more than once I've had people that I know ask me if they thought that my masculine energy had helped me. And I was like, what do you mean masculine? Which is, it's funny.
Maybe not the best wording.
The first time somebody, like they've used that wording more than once as well. And the first time somebody asked me, I was like so surprised. We were walking across the field in Cambridge. I was so surprised. I wasn't watching where I was going and I tripped over a rabbit hole. But I just thought that was really interesting. So I was like, I'd never really thought of it until somebody pointed it out to me. And I was like, oh, actually, you know, my entire life, I grew up playing football, playing rugby. I was in cadets. Like, I'm really comfortable in male-dominated environments. I always have been. So, you know, how could that not influence how I would progress in my career?
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess we've kind of covered bi-erasure, I think, pretty well. So perhaps if we ask 2 more questions and then we're good.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the concerns of queer women have been sometimes dismissed as unimportant, distracting, or delegitimizing the concerns of white, straight, cisgender women on the tenure track. Is there a divide between queer and straight women in astronomy?
I mean, I haven't experienced that, but that doesn't mean it's not there. I think it's kind of even a hard thing to say because it is, you know, thinking about the people who I have known, you know, in my career in astronomy so far, the number of women is just so low that and in physics, I mean, I've always been in physics departments as well, which I know makes a difference. Like if you're in an astronomy department, that can be less the case. But the the number of women is just so low that, and as I said, you know, to be honest, a lot of them are queer. That it hasn't really been something I've experienced, because there's so few women that would not, you know, be something that would come up as being a division, because, you know, the value of numbers has been more valuable than wanting to, you know, fight amongst ourselves, I guess. I mean, that being said, I'm sure that is an experience that some people have.
I think as well, maybe it depends on, not to say like generation, but, you know, 10 years ago, things were different. Whereas now we're kind of, I feel like, you know, myself and my cohort are kind of much more, we have this idea about intersectionality much better in a way that we didn't even 10 years ago. Yeah, definitely.
I don't know also if it kind of, and maybe this is, again, I'm kind of speaking off the cuff, so feel free to correct me if this is, you know, a silly thing to say, but I mean, a great deal of the concerns, I would say that, you know, when you think about like the concerns of, you know, like straight women in astronomy are to do with, you know, support for family type, you know, child rearing and maternity leave. And I mean, that's obviously not everything, but it's some of it. And I imagine it might be some of the types of concerns that perhaps may have been lower on the overall agenda, or you know, the gay agenda, quote unquote, in decades past, because it wasn't as, you know, legally or societally possible to, for, you know, queer couples to see that as viable, you know, with adoption becoming, you know, possible in for queer couples in more and more places, and you know,
whereas now that's changing very much so.
Yeah. So I feel like, you know, when I thought about this question, I thought, you know, what are the issues that, you know, are different, and of course there are, but I guess like I don't know, it's just difficult, because for me, I think, you know, okay, well, one thing that's obviously very much an LGBT issue that like doesn't directly affect straight cis women is access to trans healthcare, right? Like that does not affect directly straight cis women, but I just, it seems so insane to me to look at people saying we need to support, you know, our you know, trans colleagues in them getting healthcare, and say, well, that's you know, you're ruining it for everybody else. Like that's a bizarre construct, and I'm sure there are people who think like that, but
I think a good analogy there is rights aren't cake, right? Like there's not like a finite amount of cake, and some more for somebody else doesn't mean less for you.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, like I guess I have had experiences where, you know, okay, so maybe one example would be, I was asked if there was a situation in which it would have been helpful to have numbers of people of different genders attending outreach events, like written down for like recording, you know, were we reaching women or were we whatever. And, you know, this was for a number of different events, and I was coordinating, you know, I was helping run like an LGBT meetup or something, and people were like, oh, and Danielle, did you know, write down how many women were there? And I was like, no, I didn't write down how many women were there. I didn't ask the people at the LGBT meetup to write down their gender and be recorded. Are you kidding me? Like, so yeah, there's I guess that's a very small way in which that has, you know, come up. But
okay, I guess oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was just about to say we're almost out of time here. So maybe, I mean, I see this last question. Maybe Cass, you were going to ask this, but yeah, just closing out here. Any advice that you have for bisexual women starting their careers, or more broadly for folks in the LGBT plus community?
Yeah, I think the main thing I would say is to find the network. And that's easier said than done. But if you can, it's so amazing. It's such a sense of community. So what I mean by that is, you know, if you're talking about like, if you're an undergraduate, you know, go to your campus LGBT event, like club, and don't just go because like it's cool to like meet people, you know, across the campus, like do that. But also, I bet you'll see a few physics majors there, right? Like I bet you'll see people from your classes who you wouldn't have known were your, you know, your network. And I don't just mean network in like a, you know, kind of scummy professional way. I mean like your network of peers. And you know, maybe you'll meet graduate students there who are in astronomy who can help you, you know, point you towards the things you need to know about applying for grad school. Like maybe some of your profs will be at some of the events. Like, you know, you can figure out this community that for me has been, yeah, so helpful. And it doesn't have to be just through these formal sort of types of events, although that's a great way. Like I have found that as soon as I'm out even a little bit, all of a sudden, lots of other people are coming out to me. And that's great. And it's not like you need to like put a sticker on your door that says, you know, hi, I'm gay, like come talk to me or whatever. But, you know, if you feel safe to be, you know, to test the water a little bit with, you know, with the people around you, you may find that you have more of a community than you thought. And that could be so valuable because you are in a position where as like a young, you know, queer scientist where, you know, especially as a woman, where you are going to be not accessing exactly the same mentoring or even like peer mentoring opportunities that, you know, perhaps like the sort of average, you know, straight, cis, able-bodied white male physics student or astronomy student is able to access. And so like, in addition to, you know, the wonderful sort of interpersonal connections that you can make, and like friends and people, you know, where you can sort of let your hair down and not have to worry about, you know, explaining yourself in every professional situation. So there's that aspect, but there's also the aspect where like, you may find a queer role model that you didn't necessarily know you had. So yeah, so yeah, that's the main thing I would say, find that community. So like if you're going to the AAS, go to the, you know, stuff like that, like find the people, because we're there.
Great. Well, I think that just about does it for our time.
Yeah.
So I think let's. We're so grateful for you joining us for this. You know, still early in the stages, but this has been a really great chat. So thank you, Danielle.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So this is Out in Space, and we hope everyone enjoyed it. And we'll be bringing you more LGBT+ content soon. So thanks very much.